subject of ancient Egypt and its very Africanness. Let's give a warm welcome to Professor Ehret and the title here of his talk, The Africanity of Ancient Egypt. Welcome.
Well, thank you all. I want, as I've been doing, to again thank the Hutchins Center, the Center for African Studies, and all the variety of people from Professor Gates and Abby Wolf on through all the great people that I've been working with that are on their team. It's been a great experience, and this is an honor to me and a great time I've certainly been having. I hope I can make it at least of some interest to you as well. So, my beginning comment here, ancient Egypt was in Africa. We can't really doubt that, can we? It's in the continent. But more important, ancient Egypt was of Africa. And that, of course, is not the way the past 2 centuries of Western scholarship have generally presented its history. It's long past time, I would say, for all of us to discard a whole set of old notions about Egypt, notions rooted in really the self-serving racialist presumptions of 19th century Europeans, notions that only too often people even today simply assume. They've never thought to examine those ideas. They're back in the background informing our minds even when we're not aware they are. And on the historical and the scholarly level, that re-examination is underway. The most recent, maybe we should say generations, the last 30 years or so, of scholars and scholarship on Nubia and Egypt are bringing together a whole new body, and maybe I should say whole new bodies of evidence, revealing the African rootedness of pre-dynastic and early dynastic Egyptian culture. By the way, this is just going off here for a second. Some of you may have seen or heard about a recent genetics article that makes the ancient Egyptians out to be Levantines. Let me be very clear, these findings come from one locale in a large stretch of possible locales in northern Egypt, and the finds date well after the foundational periods of ancient Egypt. It's somewhat as if, I was thinking of this particular image, rather than investigating DNA from a 17th century cemetery in Plymouth, we instead choose to investigate DNA from a later 19th century cemetery in South Boston. And then we conclude, having done that the United States was founded by people of Irish descent, and that Americans were predominantly are predominantly Irish. Well, that isn't necessarily how the writers of the article meant it to be interpreted, but that's certainly the way I've had people interpreting it to me. Even someone with a Coptic, seemed to be a Coptic last name from the sounds of things, berating me for being such a terrible human being all these years of my whole career, for ever having thought of Egypt as being African. So anyway, there is a deeper problem here. Genetics may be able to tell us about the different elements in our individual genetic, physical ancestries that we may have partaken, come from in our individual selves. But genes do not at all determine language. It's our own historical, cultural, life experiences, personal experiences that determine what languages speak, not our genes. Now, the foundational areas of Egypt also, of ancient Egypt, also encompass not northern Egypt, but a whole range of lands extending far across northeastern Africa. And there are actually two ancient Egyptian foundational stories that I'd like to tell, and so that gives me an opportunity to change our slide. Well, one of these we might call the deep time story, the story of cultural and historical developments from the 6th millennium on down to around 3100 BCE. Way deep time story, with its beginnings before 15,000 BCE. And the setting for the way deep time story takes us even farther south in northeastern Africa. So to give things their proper historical order, let's do first things first. Let's begin with that earlier way deep story. In doing so, we'll consider the kinds of historical evidence that I'm particularly known for applying, comparative linguistic and cultural evidence, along with archaeology. To excavate this history, we must set out, first of all, the language relationships of ancient Egyptian. Now, ancient Egyptian belonged to the Afroasiatic language family. Small digression here. There is an older name for the Afroasiatic family, a horrendously bad name. The alternative name, Hamito-Semitic. You recognize the name Ham, of course, here in Hamito. To still use that name today is to perpetuate the horrific invention by racists of a myth used to justify enslaving Africans. And it's the slaver's own myth, it's not truly biblical, that Ham was the ancestor of all Africans, so they could get the Africans they wanted into their myth. That God had passed Noah's curse on to Ham's supposed descendants by giving them dark skins. And even more horrifying to me, still in our own day, I've been discovering there are only too many American fundamentalist Christians who still hold to this myth. It's really shocking and sad to see. So avoid this name as if it were the plague, or indeed the 7 plagues of ancient Egypt. So back to our topic. 3 initiating questions this really requires from us. First, how and when did the language directly ancestral to ancient Egyptian come to be spoken along the Egyptian Nile? And answering that question requires 2 other questions to answer. Where does the ancient Egyptian fit in the family tree of relationships within the Afroasiatic language family? And where were the languages of the family most probably spoken at different points along the lines of descent in the family tree, which we haven't quite yet shown you? So first we need to view the family tree of Afroasiatic. What I'm going to do is treat a little series of slides here, tracking the lines of descent of ancient Egyptian back to the original Proto-Afroasiatic language. So there, that gets you to ancient Egyptian, and back through these successive earlier stages back to Proto-Afroasiatic, the mother language of the whole family. So 2 primary methods apply in proposing the ancient locations of people. The first is the principle of fewest moves, often called least moves, but I'm a little uncomfortable because moves should have fewest, not least, but anyway. The most probable history of a spread of a language family is the history that most parsimoniously, we're getting to Occam's razor here, accounts for the later locations of the languages of the family. The most probable history is, in other words, the history that requires the fewest and the most direct and straightforward movements of people into new lands, people who speak languages of the family. And a second principle, which is related, we might call the center of diversity principle. Well, in similar fashion, we can use this principle for language families. If there is a region where the earliest branching of a language family, where the earliest branchings of that family cluster close to each other, that will be most likely the region where the languages of the family have longest been spoken. So, how do these principles apply to ancient Egyptian? Well, the geography of the successive branchings of the Afroasiatic tree puts it beyond doubt in my mind, beyond reasonable doubt is the term I would use, that the family originated somewhere in the Horn of Africa, in and around that region, and two, that speakers of the languages of the family then spread in a step-by-step succession of advances outward from the Horn. So back to the family tree. And here I've underlined a few key groups so that you can see be able to identify them when we get to them. The tracking of this history begins with the first two divergences of the family. Initially, the Proto-Afroasiatic language diverged into two daughter languages. Each daughter language was ancestral to one of the two primary branches of the family. You can see we have two primary branches way up at the top of the tree. One was Proto-Omotic. I hope that arrow popped up so you can see it. Proto-Omotic, and that's ancestral to the Omotic branch of the family. And then there's a second proto-language, Proto-Erythraic, ancestral to the rest of the family. We've given the name Erythraic, that is to say Red Sea, knowing our ancient history, everyone here, of course. This is this second primary branch for geographical regions that will start to become apparent as we map the next several stages in this history. Now, at the second stage of early Afroasiatic history, the Erythraic branch then itself diverged into the Proto-Erythraic language diverged into two daughter languages. That branch, in other words, began to develop into two secondary branches of its own. One of these branches was shall I go back again there because I popped it up too quick? The Cushitic branch. Okay. Now, this branch continued over the long course of its history to be spoken in regions in and around the Horn of Africa. The evidence is clear and straightforward. The first two periods of divergence in the family took place somewhere broadly in or around. I'm wondering what happened to two. There we go. Let's take it back to here. What we'll do is we'll look at it this way. Here let's look first at where the Omotic branch is located on the map. Then here's where the Cushitic family, at its widest expansion, it's not as widely expanded anymore, but around 1000 BCE, but it's all around the Horn of Africa. Okay, so that's our two things. The first two branches took place in and around the Horn of Africa. We need to postulate just a single additional advance northward. The spread, if we take ourselves back to the tree, the Proto-North Erythraic, shall I make its arrow pop in there? Proto-North Erythraic. Okay, let's taking ourselves onward. It requires only a single expansion northward out of the northern part of the Horn of Africa to spread the North Erythraic branch northward. Who might have been the people then that could have taken advantage and moved that economy northward to Egypt? Well, the linguistic maps of the successive earlier periods of Afroasiatic divergence that we briefly looked at, they offer one strong possibility, and that is the divergence of the Proto-Northeast Erythraic speakers out of the earlier Erythraic community.
Could you explain that in Egypt upper is lower and lower is upper? Just so
I was presuming on my audience, but upper means farther upstream, so therefore it's to the south, and lower, and so when we say Lower Nubia, that's going to come up too. Lower Nubia is nearer to the upper Egypt part, and Upper Nubia is farther south because the river, upriver is south. Thank you, that's very useful. So, So this is sort of the thing that I see. Now, quite independently of anything I might have written, this view has now become common understanding among the cohort or cohorts of archaeologists who have contributed so greatly over the past 3 decades to widening and deepening our knowledge of those regions and those times. So in a recent article in the major journal Antiquity, David Wengrow and his co-authors bring these findings together. Their title is a telling one: Cultural Convergence in the Neolithic of the Nile Valley, a prehistoric perspective on Egypt's place in Africa. What they describe taking place is the emergence from around 6,000 BC onward across that whole expanse from a few hundred kilometers south of the Blue and White Nile confluence to as far north as El Badari in Middle Egypt. And they call it a primary pastoral economy. But they then go on to show that the cultural commonalities across these regions went far deeper than that. And the economy, by the way, was not completely pastoral. This is partly the bias of what you get to discover in the archaeology. But even little bits of the archaeological evidence, and certainly the linguistic evidence, indicate the cultivating and harvesting of grains, and certainly on the Sudan side of things of other crops as well. From south, there we go, so let's put that down. I should have let you see it up there and not just told you, shouldn't I? Okay, onward. Now, from south of the Blue Nile, White and Blue Nile confluence to the around just a bit north of the latitude of Aswan, it appears from the differences we can detect that the participants in this history of culture interaction would have spoken languages of the what's called the Eastern Sudanic or the Eastern Sahelian branch of the Nilo-Saharan language family, a different language family, with its origins in the area of what modern-day Sudan and South Sudan. From a little north of Aswan to El Badari in Middle Egypt, they would have spoken, it appears, dialects of the language that was to evolve into ancient Egyptian. Now, before we go on any further, there's something else very important for us to understand. I've kind of mentioned it previously, but we need to understand the geographical setting. For this historical period, forget the idea of ancient Egypt as a gift of the Nile. Along the Nile, and here's where this slide becomes relevant, as well as in the surrounding steppe grasslands, from south of the confluence to El Badari. Again, to quote Wengrow and his co-authors, treatments of the dead became remarkably uniform. Burials followed, quote unquote, a common ritual template. And they did so whether the local population spoke a Nilo-Saharan language or an ancestral form of the ancient Egyptian language. Here is more than I will take us through individually, but if it's supposed to be in your handout, I hope it's there. Here is a slide where you can see what those features were. So for easier reference, I hope that the listing is there. So, okay. And there's a second key historical point to make here. More often than not, it appears that new features of culture, new notable features, tended to have their origins in the more southerly areas, among people who would have spoken not early ancient Egyptian, but languages of the Nilo-Saharan family. Now, if you look back at your list of grave goods, mace heads, for example, appear first in burials in the Sudan. In the 6th millennium, it's by the 4th millennium that they finally become common in Upper and Middle Egypt. And for your fun, here's a couple of mace heads of rather famous ones, late 4th millennium kings who were involved in the lead-up developments to the consolidation of Old Kingdom Egypt. The one on the left can be connected with the king known as Scorpion. The one on the right is for Narmer, who is either, in some people's view, the founding king or the king just before the founding king of the Old Kingdom. So, a couple of nice little cases here. Now, similarly, prominent ceramic styles evolved out of styles initiated farther south. To use the term of the eminent French archaeologist, Béatrice Midonrain, the ceramics all across the region in the 5th and 4th millennia were foreshadowed in later 6th millennium ceramics and early 5th in the Nile confluence region of the Sudan. So in witness of that, here are a few striking ceramic images. It's always fun. Now these are really dark black burnished pots, but because it's an old photograph from 50 or 70 years ago anyway, and black and white, and I took it straight out of the book instead of having a first-hand copy, you don't see the real blackness. But here we can take ourselves way north from Shahinab, way down in Sudan, which you can see on your map, way up to the other end to El Badari in the later 5th millennium. And you can see also the development that starts taking place by this period of red as well as black burnished ware. So you get this combination of things. And here, 4th millennium pots, Lower Nubia, that means sort of northern Nubia, south of Egypt, Nilo-Saharan speaking areas. And here's also from Lower Nubia. I want to point out on this one in particular, the rippling, which as far as we can see, actually begins south of Egypt and then spreads as a decorative motif northward. So here's with rippling in Kustul and onward with some early things, and even taking us on to Kerma in the 3rd millennium. We're in Upper Nubia, Upper Nubia here, so I'll get mixed up too. Wow, here we go. And those really are still making black burnished ware, but again, it's a photograph that takes away the beauty of that burnishment. Now, that's not the only evidence. We also have lexical evidence, linguistic evidence, and not surprisingly, at least one of these bits of lexical evidence evokes something about the shared ceramic technique. By the way, the funny way that things are written, we don't have the vowels properly from the earliest Egyptian. And so what you're getting is the consonants. The 3 is my attempt to represent how the aleph, the glottal stop representation anyway, which regularly at the end of words I've been able to show in my reconstructions, very often regularly comes from an earlier R, and then you can see the R in the Nilo-Saharan version that it came from. So here are 3 slides with some of the remnant finds that they're all over the place there, but anyway, this is one particular set of slides. Here is one where you see on the left the archaeologist's reconstruction of how they were when they were still upright. And I give you a third one just to give you an idea of how demanding the transporting and setting up of the individual microliths must have been for the people who lived in that era. Think Stonehenge, and yet we are 3,000 years earlier than Stonehenge. Okay, and the other sort of materials around about indicate that this is more of the Nilo-Saharan speaking areas where this ritual center was. There were 3 primary megalithic alignments. There's a possibility now suggest that Nabta, more recent archaeological studies, served probably for centuries as a ritual center, not just in the 5th millennium, which these particular alignments date to, but that it served for centuries as a ritual center with possibly the founding times as early as the late 7th millennium BCE. Now, there are 2 big stories that I'd see here if we look wider at the sort of settlement areas around and near this ritual center. First, the building of these arrays, the associated ritual burials, the grave goods indicate some kind of level of political concentration, sufficient already by the 5th millennium BCE for mobilizing a large labor force and keeping it at work over an extended period. So in all likelihood, Nabta lay in the lands of a state of some kind, a small state or centralized early big chiefdom, centuries before such consolidation, at least in most parts of Egypt. One or more large polities initially in the regions of the Naqada culture in Upper Egypt, the invention of writing, and finally, by around 3100 BCE and the 31st century BCE, the conquest and establishment of the Old Kingdom, unifying all the Nile regions from Aswan to the Delta. And also one of the things that happened here during that period, in the 31st century, there was a major raid southward that under Hor Aha, which apparently was meant to depopulate what the people that were there because apparently they considered the coastal region to be an area of potential danger. And so we see a real, it's a real cutting down of the population. They seem to have driven people out and deliberately made sure that that land wasn't going to be a threat in the future. Now, even then, the Old Kingdom continued to have cultural things that showed the wider connection to the Middle Nile cultural world. And one kind of indication, of course, were the celestial ideas and imageries. In addition, it appears that a notable ritual practice, with its origins farther south, played a role in early royal observances of the Old Kingdom. During the first dynasty of Old Kingdom Egypt, royal tombs at Abydos, it now appears, contained not just the graves of the rulers themselves, but also the graves of a large number adjacent graves, a large number of high status individuals buried next to the king, apparently to accompany and look after him in the afterlife. As many as 300 people in the case of the second king, even 135 subsidiary graves in the case of the fifth ruler. So some things to be learned there and maybe tried to be better understood. Now, this ritual treatment of the king's death was similarly practiced early in Nubia, and it was a ritual feature present still in the high age of the Kerma kingdom of Upper Nubia in the 2nd millennium BCE. And more than that, this is a ritual practice that historians have encountered in the history of a number of later Nilo-Saharan speaking or Nilo-Saharan influenced kingdoms in the Sudan belt of Africa, from pre-Christian Nubia to as far west and as late as the empire of the Ghana in around the 8th or 9th, maybe as late as the 10th century CE, AD. Okay, to sum up, the second story of the Africanity of Egypt is the story of how the institutions and ideas that we see in the ritual, for instance, of the Old Kingdom Egypt took shape during the 6th to 4th millennia BCE within this wider multi-ethnic sphere of cultural interaction and cultural convergence, the Middle Nile culture area, at least as I call it. And it's a story of how quite a number, maybe many, of the notable cultural features in Egypt had their origins among Nilo-Saharan neighbors of theirs to the south. Now, I want to close today with two proposals for critical rethinking by historians, and I hope by all of us. First, it's well past time, I think, for a critical re-examination of the use by historians and by all of us of the word civilization. It's your ritual responsibility. It's not because you have to enslave people to build the pyramids. This is your cultural responsibility to the people who have the ritual power and position. It is the concentration of wealth and ideological power that gave both royalty and priesthoods the means to support professional artists. It was people living in small-scale societies who produced some of the most notable early technological advances. And I talked about ones in a previous day, those in Africa where that happened. And it happened in small-scale societies. Egypt is a place where the inventions of smaller-scale societies, that knowledge crossed. So, my second closing thought, we do no service to the project of giving Africa its just historical due if we continue to plant our feet in one region of the continent and look outward. One of the problems in world history is people plant their feet somewhere in Eurasia and they look outward at the rest of the world when they try to write their world history books. All we've done is plant our feet a little farther southward, not in the Levant or the Mesopotamia or southern Europe, but in Egypt, to make Egypt the source for the rest of Africa of some abstract quality or maybe mythical quality of civilization, is still to treat the rest of Africa as peripheral to world history, to continue to treat the accomplishment of the rest of Africa's peoples as derivative. Africans everywhere on the continent, well, the further you get away from the middle of the world, the more you are, but anyway, so if you live up in the Arctic and Siberia, you're kind of getting toward the edge. But Africans nearly everywhere on the continent were not off the edge of history. Instead, they were innovative, contributors in integral ways and participants in each of the major transitions of long Holocene age. That was my sort of topic for last time. And they did not need some special people in one part of the continent to bring these developments to them. Africans in West and Central Africa were historical and technological innovators in their own right, possessing, for example, ceramic technology long before Egypt and even longer, maybe before the Middle East. And it now appears earlier having iron technology as well. So it's long past time to give all of Africa its proper due in the history of mankind, and I hope we are able to somehow move that venture forward. It's a difficult one to do. We live in a cultural world that we didn't make, but we're in it, so there we are. Well, one kind of simple answer is the ethnocentrism. I mean, all these people they discover in Europe ancient Egypt and say, oh, must be people like us. Well, no. And so I think we start out with those sorts of viewpoints, but we also have the horrific history in between of people needing to cut parts of Africa out of their perception of things. Otherwise, they're going to have to accept the guilt and the horror of what they're doing. Now, as far as Africa goes, Europeans and Middle Easterners and East Asian people are used to trying to find written records of things. So we have to retool ourselves to understand how much we can get from the other kind of records. So that very fact, oh, we can read and write, they can't or something. Well, they didn't choose to. But they chose to be an oral society and have elaborate representations and presentations and continuing of things. But so we start out with a deficit because we're starting with the presumption of what is going to give us historical evidence. We start out with a deficit understanding for how we can do it for the other areas of the world. Anyway, I'm going off on too many things.
There's a south to north migration of people, and that the culture basically started there and not in Egypt. And he's definitely letting people know that Egypt is in Africa and also of Africa. So I liked when you said that it was of, because I read that in the book and wanted to throw the book across the room. It made no sense to say Egypt is in Africa, but it's not of Africa. So it didn't make any sense. And I literally read that in a book. So when you said that, I was like, yes. But
well, that's what my first several sentences today were about.
Exactly.
Exactly that. This is ridiculous. We're dealing with centuries of the need of people north to have a particular view of the world, and look, it's so important for many certain older Egyptologists. They have this idea in their head, and they can't imagine the world could be different. Right. And you see, what's his name? The guy who grew up in the Navajo reservation. There's someone else I know well and shows my age. I'm losing names. Anyway, wrote this. Who?
Fred Wendorf?
No, not Fred, but anyway, whatever. The deal is he came out right away with an article after Bruce Williams came out saying, oh, well, there may have been some chiefdoms down there or something, but there's not really kingdoms. No, you had no basis. He had no basis for saying that. He didn't confront the evidence that Bruce gave him. Anyway, thank you all. Thank you.
Thanks to Chris Ehret, Charles Bonnet, Rita Freed, and other brilliant scholars. We know the truth here. And that's the way it is. Let's give it up for Christopher Ehret for a brilliant series of lectures.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all.